Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Okay, so this administration, which is almost coming to an end.
Yeah.
Almost done, has framed itself as a real climate champion. And I think the evidence would suggest there's a lot of evidence to back up an assertion like that. The Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, a slew of new regulations targeting pollutants have made real progress in promoting clean energy and cleaning up the environment. And it's also the case that right now, the United States is producing more oil and gas than any other country in the world. Production is expanding, drilling, exploration continues. And so I guess I want to understand, how does the administration view its role at this moment in both promoting clean energy but also overseeing record levels of fossil fuel production? How do you reconcile these two things?
Yeah, look, we have focused really hard on making sure that the clean energy sector, and that means the deployment of clean energy and the industrial capacity to manufacture clean energy technologies, is a very powerful magnet for capital and capital formation. And we've been massively successful at that. You see the deployment statistics. 96% of what will be added to the grid this year is clean. You have $900 billion announced to expand manufacturing capacity of clean energy technologies. But the president and the vice president have been very clear, especially punctuated by the energy shocks associated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that we need to maintain stability, that we need to protect consumers. And I think that is actually a facilitator of energy transition. You know, you had yellow jackets in the streets when I think Europeans, France in particular, tried to move without, I think, mindfulness to this question of what you do to consumer and retail energy prices. Instead, here in the United States, you've got hard hats at factories and construction sites in an unprecedented fashion. So the president really changed the formula for climate action, and at the heart of it is growth and increased economic capacity and rebuilding the American middle class. So I don't think, I appreciate the focus on what is the productivity flow at this moment. I think the real scorecard is, where is the long life infrastructure CapEx going? And that's almost exclusively to clean energy.
And as you say, this is truly a long-term problem. And I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. One of the challenges I always see people trying to navigate is that this is the ultimate long-term problem, and yet we're always consumed with these short-term crises. And I think what you just articulated sort of demonstrates that. Yeah, we want to invest for the long term, but it can be very challenging to make decisions that might raise energy prices in the short term. So as we think about the long-term target that the president set when he came into office, I believe it was to cut emissions roughly 50% below 2005 levels by the end of this decade. The Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other measures you've implemented over the last 3.5 years get us to about 40% of that goal, if I have it right. But this record oil and gas production, you said, we just talked about, I have to believe is working as a counterbalance to that. So is the U.S. on track to actually meet that goal?
So I don't think the production actually is the counterbalance. I think there are headwinds that we've seen, and in some ways they're headwinds produced by the dog that caught the car. So we, set out to reshore American manufacturing, and we've seen that happen in incredible fashion all across the country. That's bringing back really heavy energy users to manufacture things like solar. 4 times the production capability today in the United States than we had when we took office. Batteries, 15 gigafactories and counting, coming online. And so that's one big piece of it. The second big piece of it is securing U.S. dominance in artificial intelligence, making sure that we're building those data centers here, building those models here, and we will be successful at that. But I think that adds additional load to the grid. So I think there are certainly headwinds. In the fundamentals, though, we're in a really good place to go the distance. In terms of the gap that remains, look, I think there's more that we need to do in terms of the grid. I think there's more that we need to do in the ag and forestry arena, where we've made massive progress. 80,000 farmers are signed up for climate smart agriculture. We can go the distance there. And then there's opportunity in industrial decarbonization, which interrelates with trade. In fact, later today, I'll be speaking at the Yale Club, laying out the progress we've made as part of the White House Climate and Trade Task Force, building really for the first time the foundation for a uniform government-wide approach to measure carbon intensity in products. And I think that will help us lean into the competition that's now set off around the world to be the first to decarbonize the industrial sector.
Okay, so when you think back to that original goal that the president set, do you believe the U.S. is actually on track to meet that?
We will meet
emissions by roughly 50% below 2005 levels by the end of this decade.
We will absolutely meet that goal. And let's remember when we set it, the U.S. was on track to get to 18 to 20% emissions reduction by 2030. We set that goal in April 2021. It's 2024. The goal's for 2030. So just to sequence it out, we've more than doubled our decarbonization trajectory in 3.5 years. And I'm willing to bet that the United States is going to continue to put points on the board and will absolutely meet the goals.
Okay. You talked about some of the many ways the Inflation Reduction Act is starting to put boots on the ground. I've been there. I've seen some of these projects. It's a real manufacturing boom that's happening in certain parts of this country, thanks to some of those tax incentives. But we also know that some of the ambitions are being thwarted. And you mentioned transition. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we get through some of those obstacles. Because it's one thing to build a lot of new renewable capacity, but we got to get that energy out to where the people need it most. And transmission in particular is still being held up by permitting, by really old infrastructure, by NIMBYism. What can the administration actually do to start clearing some of those roadblocks?
So there are, I think, two aspects to transmission, and I'll add a third thing that we should all be thinking about when we think about the grid. On transmission, one thing that I think is understood and underappreciated is our capacity to manufacture things like transformers and circuit breakers and HVDC cabling, which actually you see the cues for that increasing year after year, and we need to build that capacity here. Part of my message at Climate Week has been to encourage investors to fill in that gap. We need the market to be responsive and to grow in a very big way. In terms of permitting, we've either approved or financed 4,000 miles of high-voltage transmission lines. We talk about the Hoover Dam, right, this amazing accomplishment of the yesteryear as the big thing that we did. I turned dirt on a transmission line in Arizona with the vice president that is now built a few years later that will be twice the size of the Hoover Dam in terms of the voltage it moves. And you see that play out all across the country. We've actually used our executive authority to shrink down the timeline to permit transmission lines on public lands down to 2 years when it used to take 10 or 12. Will there be more reform that's necessary and needed to help us continue to accelerate the clean energy revolution? Sure, there will be. But I think what the president and vice president have done is moved the environmental consensus on development and on growth. We are on the doorstep of a YIMBY moment. We're not on the other side yet. But I think more and more folks see the economic upside of getting together more quickly and through good analysis and good engagement, building more projects more quickly.
On the doorstep of a YIMBY moment. I'll believe it when I see it. I've covered a lot of NIMBYism in my day. There's 40 days until the election, and there's a real chance that former President Trump returns to the White House. If he does, he's vowed to repeal many parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, undo many of the climate policies your administration has implemented. I understand there's only so much you can say about politics given the Hatch Act, but I think you can tell us this. What is the administration doing to ensure that the work you have done continues? What are you doing to effectively Trump-proof this work?
Look, you're right. I won't speak to the campaign, the election, or any candidate. I will say this. The politics of climate inaction, I think, are unambiguously deteriorating in the United States. House Republicans have taken 50 votes to try to roll back either the IRA or other parts of the climate agenda, and they have failed every time to get the bill over the line. And you actually now have 12.5 House Republicans who've written to their leader saying, hey, let's knock it out. Let's stop doing this because we will be pulling the rug out from underneath the 330,000 clean energy jobs that have been created in the last 2 years. And that's thing number one, is for us to drive the economic benefit as far and as wide in the United States as possible. And the president has delivered in red districts and blue. He's delivered for blue-collar workers in a profound and historic way. And I think that strengthens our ability to stay on this course. The second is to continue to drive down the cost of the technologies. There is an irresistible economics associated with deploying clean energy in really, I think, every sector of the economy, and that it's in and of itself is durable and builds out momentum. But, you know, as much as we're focused on what happens on the other side of the 40 days, we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we're trying to execute every single day. And I think that is perhaps the best balm. It is the best investment, is to continue to deliver for the American people.
Yeah, I mean, just to note, though, there's two ways to read that, the focus on the next 40 days. One is that there's a lot of work to be done. The other is that there's a certain fear that come 40 days from now, it could be getting a lot harder to get that money out the door. Is there a sense of urgency to sort of move the money? I've certainly heard this from people inside different departments, that they want to get as much out as they can that can't be clawed back. Is that the case?
Look, there's been an urgency from day one on climate change. We're in the decisive decade for climate action. We're at halftime in that decisive decade. We've been moving with incredible speed and alacrity from day one. And whether it's the 40-day window or the 4-month window, we're going to be sprinting throughout. And, you know, you talk about the money. You got the EPA that's going to be 90% the way through, the largest investment we've ever made in that agency. You've got the Treasury Department, 21-plus regs and guidance out in service of making the tax credits as usable and impactful as possible. Across the board, we're looking at somewhere around 9 out of every $10 of this historic investment agenda moving into the bloodstream. So I think there's been an incredible focus on this for a very long time. And that's why we're in the position we are, where we can see the impact and we can see, I think, the tailwinds carry us.
Okay. You were just backstage with Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation. Again, I'll really ask, no, everyone, I'm very serious on this point. We're not going to be hissing. I asked you to show our guests respect, and I really mean that. I want everyone to show every single person who's up here respect. I beg you. So thank you very much. You were just backstage with Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation, which produced the Project 2025 report. In it, this 800-page document, which I'll note is not a part of a campaign or a candidate, it calls for sweeping changes to how the federal government would regulate the environment. And it says the Biden administration's climate fanaticism needs a whole of government unwinding. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the proposals in there. What would those proposals do to this nation from a climate perspective, from an environment perspective?
Look, the stuff folks are talking about are measures that improve public health, saving millions of lives, keep our kids from having asthma attacks, keep our seniors from having heart attacks. The stuff we're talking about has created the biggest expansion in American manufacturing in generations. And it's bringing back our capacity to manufacture technologies like batteries and solar that we invented here, and then we ceded to countries like China to actually be made. There is a unambiguous case to be made for a policy approach that not only delivers for the environment, but for public health, for energy costs, and for jobs. And, there have been analyses of this agenda, this corpus of work, and they show energy costs would go up for families, jobs would go down, GDP would shrink, and America would lose its ability to lead in this global clean energy race. When in the previous administration, the United States left Paris and it sidelined our workers on the clean energy foot race, the rest of the countries of the world did not stop running. And they're not going to stop running anytime in the future. So the question is, are we going to go the distance? Are we going to invest in America? Will we partner with our industry and with our workers to build those supply chains starting here and supplying the rest of the world? I think the scoreboard over the last 3.5 years shows what it looks like when you do that. And I don't think there's the politics to implement the kind of agenda that would take us backwards on that important task.
I'm glad you raised the international perspective, because this is a global issue. We've been talking about it already this morning. It's going to take global partnership. It's going to take other countries leading on their own. China is really racing ahead on this front in terms of the production and deployment of renewable energy, in terms of the EV market, where, I think it was, 1 million or more EVs were sold in the past month, compared to about the same number in the United States in a year. And this all comes at a time when the United States, on both sides of the aisle, has an increasingly protectionist stance against China. We're putting on tariffs. Have a very hesitant posture to allow Chinese EVs, Chinese renewables into our borders. And I wonder, this is starting, we're hearing this from the clean energy folks, to have a real impact on their ability to move as fast as they would like, they say. And so I guess 2 questions. One, is the U.S. at risk of ceding its climate leadership to China? And 2, has the protectionism gone too far at this point?
It's a focus on leveling the playing field. This is about fair play. It's about leveling the playing field from a trade perspective, and frankly, leveling up. How do we integrate considerations around labor? The president signed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There is no place for forced labor in any supply chain. And certainly as we build out a new industry, we've got to root it out right at the start. The panels that are manufactured in China are twice as dirty from an embodied carbon perspective as the United States. We got to look at those emissions as they move across borders as well, which is part of the reason we're setting up this data system. I think so. We've got to have that work be central to building a sustainable clean energy future. And you saw with chips what happens when you have a vulnerable, concentrated, and brittle supply chain. You have one country that can control whether things are going forward or not. Plants idled in the United States because we ceded the chips manufacturing capacity to China. In the decisive decade for climate action, we need robust, resilient, diverse supply chains. So I think it's not about cheaper today. It's about, are we investing in the value to go the distance? And I think that's an essential way to think about being successful on the climate task. The other piece I'd say is, from an innovation perspective, the country that owns the shop floors to manufacture stuff will be the country that owns the future in terms of commercializing innovation. We may be coming from behind on the battery race today because of the manufacturing capacity we ceded, but because of the industrial capacity we're building today, I think we could win on the next generation of batteries like solid state. I was in Dalton, Georgia. I walked from one solar factory that had been built to the second fab on the same campus a few months later, and they had boosted process efficiency by 30%. That happens when you invest in manufacturing.
Yeah, and let's come back to the IRA for our last few questions. A key goal was to jumpstart the electric vehicle industry in this country. And yet, more than 2 years on, hardly any new charging stations have been built with those federal funds that were allocated. How many? Give us a number.
We have doubled the number of charging stations in the United States. By the end of this month, we'll be at about 200,000 public charging stations. We're adding 1,000 chargers a week in the United States. And that's not propelled by some magic that's going on in the world. It's propelled by the fact that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris worked really hard to go from 0 chargers being manufactured in the United States to 40 factories manufacturing those chargers. No real meaningful tax incentive to a 30C tax incentive that is propelling a lot of this investment from retail firms, from the private sector, from the OEMs themselves. And we're doing the hard part behind the private sector to patch up, especially in rural areas and on those long highway corridors, with a state-implemented system that's taking time because it's doing the hardest part of the charger build-out. But 200,000 chargers, and by the way, Joe Biden set a goal for 500,000 chargers by 2030. All estimates are that we will reach that goal 2 or 3 or 4 years early. So, I don't know. I look at that, it looks pretty good.
Okay, and yet despite that, car makers are pulling back EV expansion plans. Factories are on hold. EV sales growth is slowing. So what went wrong? If you're building all the chargers, if you got the tax credits for electric vehicles that are still going out the door, why is this industry struggling right now?
I think this industry is calibrating through one of the most significant shifts in automotive technology that we've seen in a generation. And August was the highest month for EV sales. It was the highest month for plug-in hybrid sales. It broke all of the records. Capital formation continues to be absolutely remarkable. The United States went from a laggard, especially relative to China, a laggard in the world on private capital investment into clean energy, to becoming the #1 nation destination for private capital investment into the EV revolution. Folks said, oh, this will happen, but workers will be left behind. No, the UAW is making these vehicles. They've unionized not just in Warren, Ohio, but they're making union batteries in Tennessee. Companies like Hyundai and the German firms are manufacturing here now. So, I don't know, the way I think about it is, under the previous administration, factories in the auto sector were shutting down. In this administration, we've seen them grow at a historic pace. We are leveling up in the worker transition and making sure that our UAW carries us forward. And by the way, the technology costs keep coming down. We're going to be at sticker price parity in the next few years. So I feel really good about our ability to lead on this, and it sure beats watching China eat our lunch.
Okay, well, we'll see where this goes. We've got just a couple minutes, and I've got just a couple questions. You've painted a picture of an Inflation Reduction Act that is doing all sorts of amazing things around this country. You've been there. I've seen some of this work. And yet survey after survey shows that the American people have never heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, don't know what it is, don't know that maybe some of the things in their backyard are a result of that. Is that a policy failure or a communications failure or a political failure? What happened?
There are a lot of Americans, I bet, if you walk down the street, who don't know what the Safe Drinking Water Act is or when the Clean Air Act was implemented, but we are all the beneficiaries of environmental statutes passed 50 years ago that are producing massive gains for our public health, for our safety, and for our economy. The Inflation Reduction Act, last year, 3.5 million folks drew down Biden-Harris clean energy tax credits to improve the efficiency of their homes and reduce their energy bills. Last year, millions of folks were able to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act, its health care provisions, reducing the cost of insulin. We're seeing the United States mount the most impressive comeback in terms of manufacturing the world has ever seen, thanks to the investments in these provisions. We've launched an American Climate Corps that today has hit 15,000 young people, and by the end of the year will hit 20,000 folks enlisted in an American Climate Corps. There are benefits that abound, the 80,000 farms that are signed up for climate-smart agriculture. So, look, if your question is, if you walk down the street, can people tell you, was it H.R. 1 or H.R. 25, or what day was this bill signed that led to this? The answer is probably no. But if the question is, can folks see cause and effect? Do they understand policy matters in Washington? And do they see it improving their lives, their livelihoods, and the outlook for their kids? The answer is yes. And we are not done. We will continue to sprint through the finish line for the next 4 months to make sure they see even more of those benefits.
Ali Zaidi, the White House Climate Advisor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.